Good afternoon, everyone. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm welcome you to this very special occasion. My name is Jeff Maitland. I'm Professor of Energy Engineering in the Department of Chemical Engineering here at Imperial College. And I'm delighted to have been asked to chair this special lecture and special occasion. Welcome to you all. Welcome to everyone who's joining us online. And as well as being live streamed, this event is going to be recorded. And first of all, I need to give you a safety briefing to say that if you hear a continuous alarm, that fire alarm is real, and you should follow the emergency exit signs and leave the lecture theatre and leave the building by the front entrance. And the assembly point, if you turn to your right, is on the corner of Exhibition Road and Imperial College Road, just on the corner there. Hopefully the fireworks will be in here, not outside. Of course, we're here today to celebrate Niall's promotion to his chair in Future Energy Systems in the Centre for Environmental Policy. I'm not sure if the delay since 2020 is due to Niall's reluctance to give an inaugural lecture or whether it's due to the college backlog, and I suspect that COVID has something to do with it as well. But anyway, we're here today, so welcome. Now, I've known Niall since 2006, when he came to Imperial as a new PhD student from Ireland, and he joined me as a postgraduate tutor on a first-year course on process analysis that I was teaching. And he was enthusiastic. He was always asking questions, so nothing changes. And he was eager to get on and to take initiatives. We've been friends and colleagues ever since then. So I've watched his career develop with pleasure and a good deal of admiration. From being a lecturer in CEP in 2013 to the appointment of his chair in 2020, that speed of promotion is impressive by any standards, and that's one of the things we're here to celebrate today. So what characterises Niall's approach, I think, is not only his research into understanding and to guide the transition to a low-carbon economy, but also to actively help and enable to implement that. So he's very hands-on. So not only is he a first-rate systems process engineer, he's developed many software tools that are used to guide and optimize decarbonisation of energy and manufacturing. And he's published over 250 papers that record that, and some books as well. But he also gets out there to work with the many sectors that are using this approach: industry, policymakers, government, investors, right across the board, to use those packages and insight to make an impact on how we actually get to net zero, and it can be implemented in practice rather than on paper. And so he realizes in his approach that you need not only the engineering input, but you need to incorporate things like affordability, energy security, policy, the socio-economic consequences of what is being done. And I think he was one of the first engineers to take into account the other national and international priorities that getting to net zero is competing with, or better still, can complement. He's, as a result of this, not only done his own research, but he's had several external appointments with stakeholders who use his research and expertise. And so amongst those are Total Energies, the former department BEIS, which is now DESNES in our own government, and he's now guiding investment on carbon management technologies globally with Barclays. He's received many awards, amongst them the Nicklin Medal of the Institute of Chemical Engineers in 2015 and the Junior Moulton Medal in 2021. So he's been recognised by his academic peers as well. So I'm hoping that Niall will tell us a bit about how his research works into making the energy and the transition to net zero come into practice. But he's going to give us his take on what I think is probably the greatest global challenge of our time, that is achieving net zero equitably, on time, and within a reasonable budget. And so without further ado, Niall, I call on you to give your inaugural lecture on, welcome, getting real about net zero. So let's get Neil Ryle.
Thank you, Jeff. This is working? So, first of all, I can assure you that the delay in my giving this lecture is entirely due to my personal shyness and reluctance to speak in public. Second of all, I entirely anticipated about 3 people and 4 dogs in this room this evening, so thank you all very much for taking the time to come out and spend this with me and my friends here. As Jeff said, I would like to spend a little bit of time talking with you about where I think we are vis-a-vis this net zero transition, this energy transition, our efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change, and hopefully we will get there. But in order to start that, given how much we talk about net zero and climate change today, one could be forgiven for thinking that this is something that's come to humanity's attention maybe only in the last 5 or 10 years, something like that. So I think, therefore, it's important to recognize that humanity has been thinking about this since the 1770s. So this is back when we were asking those really fundamental natural science questions. Why are there glaciers? Why is the sky blue? And importantly, why don't we all freeze at night? And so this was the work of de Saussure back at the beginning, which then led to the hypothesis that some constituents of the atmosphere were not transparent to heat. And then, initially this was people saying, well, maybe CO2 or water or methane, they retain heat somehow. And this is also really exciting because this was a good century before we had developed the technical ability to separate the constituent components of the atmosphere, to get oxygen and nitrogen and separate them. So this is very theoretical work and really, really exciting at the time. And then by the time that we get to the middle of the 1800s, 1850s, people like Newton Foote and another Irish guy, John Tyndall, had confirmed indeed that CO2 specifically was a greenhouse gas. And at this point in time, we're well through into the Industrial Revolution. So we're burning an awful lot of coal and putting all of this CO2 up into the atmosphere, which then led Svante Arrhenius to ask the question, well, if we're burning all this coal and we're putting all this CO2 into the atmosphere and we know that this traps heat, could we get to a point where we burn enough coal that we would materially change the composition of the atmosphere, so we would trap enough heat that we would start changing the climate? And over a long and lonely winter one year in Sweden, he did all the calculations, arrived at the conclusion, yes, that was likely true. His predictions back in 1896 were very much on target with where we've actually landed today. And this calculation was subsequently independently confirmed by another Swede, Arvid Högbaum. And again, so we've known this. And so I tend to think about sort of this century as being humanity's effort to develop a theoretical model to understand the climate. And then in the course of the 20th century, we started gathering data, starting doing the observations. So in 1930s, Guy Callendar, he was the first person to actually observe a warming trend in weather data, which then, under the sponsorship of Roger Revelle, David Charles Keeling, started to actually measure in a very systematic and repeatable way the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere in Hawaii. So not a bad place to work if you can get there. And around about this period, in sort of the 1950s, 1960s, this question moved out of the exclusively academic realm and into the political. And so Lyndon Johnson, the President of the United States in 1965, publicly acknowledged that A, climate change is real, B, anthropogenic, C, dangerous, deleterious, damaging, and D, we ought to do something about it. By the 80s, Margaret Thatcher had brought this into the G7 agenda, and it was then really moving forward, which got us to the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, famously the Kyoto Protocol in 97, and then probably culminating with the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. And so this was really quite a big deal, because you can imagine this was 192 countries unanimously agreeing that they were going to aim to limit climate change or global warming to well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts toward 1.5. Now, trying to get 10 friends to agree where to go to dinner would be hard enough. 192 countries agreeing to this is a fantastic achievement. And so therefore, everyone at the time was justly, satisfied and happy and excited. However, I always think when I look at this photo that this chap with the kind of rather wry expression on the other end of the table, he's got his fingers crossed behind his back because he's got some notion of how hard this is actually going to be. So what happens next? In order to get to this sort of world of Paris, we look at CO2 emissions from fossil fuel and cement production on the y-axis against time. This is where we were back in 2015, sort of mid-ish 30s or 30-odd billion tons per annum. The idea is we had to get onto this blue trajectory into this sort of well below 2 degrees space. Unfortunately, we haven't done that. We've sort of gone on more of this sort of orange trajectory, which means that as we get to the end of the century, what we'll need to do is not only transition through this net zero point, but then get into this space where we're removing probably on the order of 20 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere every year. So to put that in context, today we're approximately 40. The global oil and gas industry in a scope 1 and 2 basis, they emit sort of 4 to 5 billion tons per annum. So creating an industry in the next 75 years that is half the size of the global economy, 4 to 5 times the size of the aggregate oil and gas industry, that's a big ask. So if you believe that this is possible, that's not a bad industry to get involved with. However, what happened next? So about this time, November 2015, we agree we're going to go for this well below 2 degrees target. Everyone sort of woke up, at least my recollection of it is everyone woke up in January of 2016 saying, well, hang on a second, what have we actually agreed to? What have we signed up for? How do we get there? How is this different? What do we need to do? So 2016, 2017 broadly characterized by a lot of work to understand what is the difference between well below 2, 1.5, all the rest of it, with the IPCCs then reporting in 2018 with their special report on 1.5 degrees, which tells us, we need to get to net zero, we need to go into carbon removal, all the rest of it, which then in 2019 led the UK to be the first major economy to commit to a legally binding target, net zero economy-wide by 2050. And that was building on what was the previous target by the UK, an 80% reduction by 2050. And that was quite good because, previous to 2019, 80% of the country thought that they were in the 20% of emissions that didn't need to be mitigated. So this net zero thing gives a lot of clarity. And following 2019, then just everybody started signing up to net zero targets by some date. And so by 2023, we had approximately 90% of the world's population GDP emissions covered by a net zero target of one kind or another. Britain and Europe aiming for 2050, China aiming for 2060, India aiming for 2070. But they were all sort of going for it. Now, obviously, since more recently, the United States has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement again, so this brings this number back down to about 77%. At this time, people get quite worked up because, the United States, they joined and they left and they rejoined, now they've left again, and everyone sort of kind of gets quite enervated about, well, is this the end of climate change mitigation? Are we going to just stop? What can we do? So it's worth thinking, what impact does the occupant of the Oval Office have on the trajectory of CO2 emissions in the United States? And if you look back, and thank you to Quinn for helping with this graphic, if you look back to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, there's no real correlation between who sat in the Oval Office, whether it was Republican or Democrat, between what happened with emissions. They just went up until they cracked shale gas under George W. Bush, at which point the emissions started coming down. Initially under Bush, then under Obama, then under the first Trump administration, then under Biden, and again under Trump. And frankly, I would expect this trajectory to broadly continue because you cannot compete with the macroeconomics of the situation, regardless of how powerful an individual office is. Now, since the Industrial Revolution, we've put something like 1.7 trillion tons of CO2 from fossil fuels and cement production into the atmosphere, about 2.5 trillion if you count all of the sort of land use change emissions. What this means is we've now changed the temperature by about 1.55, I think, degrees so far. And even if we transition to net zero tomorrow, this warming would continue for the next several hundred years. What that means is that as we need to push forward with mitigation efforts, we will also need to deal with the adaptation questions. We'll have to think of how will we adapt to this forthcoming warming. And that's important because every degree of warming matters. And now, maybe just to kind of take a break for a second and say something positive. Back in 2015, when we had the NDCs associated with the Paris Agreement, we were on track for a sort of 3.5, maybe 4 degree world by 2100. Now we're in the sort of 2.5 to 3 degree space. So that's probably the most positive thing we can say, but it really does matter. Every half a degree matters in this context because as you move forward with warming, the chances of tipping points increases. So for example, you can get at relatively low degrees of warming, the possibility of ice sheet collapse increases. As you get ice sheet collapse, you get potential for disruption of the AMOC, the circulation in the Atlantic, which in turn can reduce precipitation in the Amazon, which causes that forest dieback and forest fires, which in turn changes the albedo of the Earth, which causes more warming, and you get this sort of negative feedback mechanism. So every half a degree really does matter. And the issue as well is that this will come at very significant economic cost. So for example, since the year 2000, just in the United States, economic losses associated with climate change have been something like 700 billion. And if we think about productivity losses in that same period, it's more like 4 trillion. So the climate change costs really are very significant. And if we think about going forward on our current trajectory, it's likely to lead to about a third reduction in cumulative economic growth over the century, or about 0.55% per annum. So if you think about where we are in the economic cycle today, those are significant numbers. And importantly, these impacts will not be felt in any sector of the economy in isolation, but rather broadly across the entire economy. So nobody gets spared. Now, it's also important to recognize that humans are profoundly good at taking fossil carbon out of the underground, and putting it into the atmosphere. We can have wars, we can have pandemics, depressions, more wars. We can get into, energy crises, terrorist attacks, financial crises, and pandemics. None of this really gets in the way of our ability to take carbon out of the underground and put it in the atmosphere, right? One of the things that I want to pause on is this little blip in emissions associated with the COVID pandemic. So we had a couple of years where we tried to lock the entire planet down, stop people flying, stop people traveling, all of this kind of thing. So in principle, this is very profound levels of behavioral change, which is often held out to be a really important way of mitigating our impact on the environment. I put it to you that this, whilst not zero, is not enough to justify the amount of political effort that was expended to make that change happen. It is not sticky, and it doesn't make that much difference. Behavioral change will not get us to where we need to be, not even close. Now, if we want to have a conversation about dealing with CO2 emissions, you've got to then think about where does the CO2 come from? And it's overwhelmingly almost 3/4 from how we produce and use energy, right? So therefore we need to think carefully about how the energy system is evolving over time. In that context, we often talk about what's called the energy trilemma, this idea that energy needs to be equally available, it needs to be reliably available, it needs to be secure, and it needs to be sustainable. So it needs to be affordable, sustainable, and reliable. And when it's presented like this, the argument is that all elements of this trilemma are equally valuable, they're equally important. And I think it's worth thinking about that. For example, when we've tried in the past to have taxes on petrol or on gasoline and diesel in France to incentivize people to stop driving quite so much and instead shift to public transport, whilst in places like central Paris, where there was a reasonable alternative to driving, you've got a good metro system, in rural France, not the case. This was perceived at the time as being just simply a tax on people's lifestyles, making their daily commutes more costly. They were not happy. This gave birth to the Gilets jaunes movement, and the French are quite good at making their feelings felt where this is concerned. Similarly, in the UK, back in, I think it was 2023, there was a by-election in Uxbridge. So this was triggered, if you'll recall, by Boris Johnson's resignation over Partygate or whatever it was called. But at the time, the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, was intending on extending the ULEZ, the ultra-low emissions zone, into the outer London boroughs, including Uxbridge. It was widely perceived that Labour lost that by-election on that basis, because the idea was that this tax, this ULEZ enforcement, would be unfairly punitive to people who were driving older cars and perhaps who were on lower wages. So the lesson here is that if green policies are perceived as being unfair or too costly, society will simply not accept. The other issue, and again, we often hear this concept of, well, we use too much energy, we're profligate in our energy use because energy is too expensive, right? It's too cheap, we leave the lights on, we leave the heating on, we're not responsible with how we use it. The reality is that if you increase heating bills, if you increase energy bills, people die. So back in 2022, we had a very, very mild winter, but associated with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, energy prices went through the roof. They became very, very expensive. European governments put about €1 trillion of money into the system in some way, shape, or form to shield the population from those energy price increases. That notwithstanding, we achieved two things. We reduced the gas usage that year on a seasonal adjusted basis, accounting for heat pump installation and all these kinds of things, by about 10%. Now that's a big swing if you're thinking about this from a gas markets perspective. It's nothing if you're thinking about from a climate change mitigation perspective. At the same time, 68,000 people in Western Europe died from fuel poverty that winter. So again, very, very challenging to propose higher energy bills as a credible means for getting the behavioral change to mitigate climate change. So therefore, what I'd propose that is, instead of an energy trilemma we're facing, it's more like an energy hierarchy. So the first thing that we must have is available energy. After that, we want it to be affordable. We want it to come from a secure and a good area. And once we have reliable and affordable and secure supplies of energy, then we can start to have discussions around its sustainability, but not the other way around. So for any would-be Sir Humphrey explaining to a Secretary of State how they might want to prioritize things, the argument is that anyone who thinks that voters will choose cleaner over cheaper or more secure forms of energy would be quite courageous, and I suspect that we're going to see some of that play out in the not too distant future. So maybe to move on, what does net zero mean? This is a term that I've thrown around quite a bit so far, but I haven't defined it. This term, it's so ubiquitous in conversation, or at least the conversations within which I participate, and maybe I don't get out enough, but it's so ubiquitous as to become meaningless. So are we thinking that we want it to be zero greenhouse gas emissions, full stop, no emissions at all? Are we thinking net zero, so we can emit a bit but take some back via carbon removal, for example? Do we want no fossil carbon, so a completely defossilized energy system, but other things like nuclear or bio or hydro and so on are okay? Or do we exclusively want wind, water, and solar? Now, you can have a conversation with a wide range of people, and lots of people will propose some of these as a solution. Whichever one you go for will have profound implications for the cost and for the operability and for the size of these systems. So, to take this, and I'm going to put my cards on the table right away. I don't care where our energy comes from, as long as it's reliable, affordable, and it doesn't put carbon into the atmosphere. So renewable energy, fantastic. Nuclear, also great. Fossil, no problem, but let's keep our thinking grounded in physics and thermodynamics and minimize recourse to unicorns and other magical thinking. And in my mind, that leaves fusion off the table, at least for now. So then let's think about how the world's energy system has evolved, again, over the course of the last couple of hundred years. Back in, say, the period 1800 to 1900, we were broadly speaking in the biomass age. The world was powered by wood. And in the Industrial Revolution, as we discussed, we started moving into the coal age. And today, we are definitively in the oil age. I think we're probably in the process of moving into a gas age. But today, oil provides the vast majority of, oil provides the largest share of the world's energy on a primary consumption basis. Now, it's also interesting to note, I think, that even though biomass has largely gone away in our energy system today, we still, in absolute terms, use more than we did back in 1800. So we have, broadly speaking, had an energy system where it's one of energy addition, not energy substitution. And for whichever sort of smart aleck in the audience wants to remind me that we no longer use town gas and we no longer use whale oil, yes, I'm aware, but broadly speaking, we're just increasing the size of the pie. The other thing to be aware of is all of these transitions, I think, historically have happened because these new forms of energy, these additional forms of energy, they've been cheaper, they've been more convenient, they've been more secure, they've been better in some way. So for example, here in the early 1900s, when we started using oil, Britain, so under Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, shifted the battleships from running on coal to running on oil. Two reasons. One, you could store a lot more energy in a ship in the form of oil than you could in the form of coal. And two, importantly, they went faster. So that gave them a strategic superiority over their competition at the time. So, again, these shifts have always been motivated by reasons of it's better, it's cheaper, it's faster, it's superior. Arguably, this current transition is one which is which has historically been motivated by words like ought and should, so a more moral dimension. And I think that adds something to the conversation. So as I was saying, really what we're looking at, I think, is a growing pie in energy addition, not energy substitution. So since 1965, yes, the absolute share, the fractional share of fossil energy has been reduced from about 1993 down to about, from 93% down to 81%, but the size of the total world's energy system has increased by a factor of about 3.5. So really this pie has gotten larger and larger. Also, an energy system of this size. So for example, if we go back, this represents in total something like 30 to 45, that order of magnitude, $1 trillion of sunk capital. And if we think about all of the kind of fossil energy resources that we know about, just those, that represents, I'm not sure what's bigger than $1 trillion, but 250 or thereabouts $1 trillion worth of existing resource base. Something that size has a lot of inertia. It moves slowly. And so, for example, over the last couple of hundred years, as we've seen the role of biomass decline, it took coal, oil, and gas 40, 50 years, so roughly half a century, to go from being 1% of the energy system to 10%, to some level of materiality. That takes 50 years. Okay, this doesn't move quickly. Now, other analysis by people like Michael Liebreich, they will disagree. So relatively recently, Liebreich presented some work showing that, well, we are currently deploying electricity, and particularly clean electricity, at a rate that is more rapid than the rate of increase in energy demand. So arithmetically, by about 2070, renewable energy, clean energy, will just squeeze fossil energy out of the global energy system, full stop. And mathematically, that logic is flawless. It follows. The issue is that the total share of electricity of our energy system, that really hasn't been changing at all over the last several decades. So again, this pie is growing. The fraction of that pie that is electricity is, broadly speaking, the same. So yes, we're increasing the amount of renewable energy in the system, but the amount of electricity as an overall share isn't really changing. So this is for the United States. And if you look at the rest of the world, it's broadly speaking the same as well. These lines are not going up. They're broadly horizontal. So the role of electricity in the energy system really hasn't been changing for 30, 40 years. So if you want to fulfill the sort of electrification narrative, and again, today the IEA had their World Energy Outlook piece, they're heralding in the era of electricity, the electric era, or whatever they were calling it. I'm not sure how you get there. We're still in many parts of the world, 80, 90% not from electricity. So we have a ways to go. The other thing is, if you want to have electricity as your primary energy source, wonderful, it's terrifically convenient, but you need to generate when it's needed, and you need to deliver it to where it's needed. What that means is you need to then deploy transmission infrastructure. The challenge here is we seem to have forgotten how to do that. So this is again the United States, but I dare say they are not alone in this challenge. The other piece again is that, yes, it's great to deliver megawatt hours of electricity when you need it and so on and so forth, but we also need to recognize that megawatt hours and megawatts of capacity are not the same thing. And if you build megawatts of intermittent capacity, wind and solar, that kind of thing, it does not in any meaningful way displace megawatts of firm capacity. So in this thought experiment that again we worked on about a decade ago, you can imagine an incumbent energy system which is characterized exclusively of firm and dispatchable power. You can start building out intermittent capacity. It doesn't really displace the underlying capacity hardly at all. It changes how you use it, so the capacity factor goes down, but it doesn't change the underlying structure of the system. And what that means is that if you then seek to displace megawatts of thermal capacity or firm capacity with megawatts of renewable plus storage, etc., the amount, as you can see on this y-axis, of renewable capacity that you have to build. I mean, it varies quite significantly depending on where you are in the world, but none of these numbers look anything close to 1. You have to build quite a lot. And that's before on the secondary y-axis, sorry, there are too many axes here, but that's before you get into how much energy storage you have to build, because you need to deal with both inter and intra-annual variations of availability of wind and solar power and so on. Now, this is quite a strict test, but you can see that relative to, on this basis, nuclear and gas with CCS, for example, look cheap by comparison. In reality, the answer is going to be much more of an overall mix of things, but this is where we get to. And again, JP Morgan have recently observed the same thing, looking at the different energy systems around the US. You don't displace firm capacity with intermittent capacity. The other narrative that we hear quite a lot is that, but renewable energy is getting so cheap that it's going to just displace everything. It's the LCOE, according to Lazard, and that's what you're seeing here. The LCOE of renewable energy is just continuously falling. Excuse me. And so therefore it will naturally displace it. However, if you again look since 2019, if you want to get a power purchase agreement, a PPA, for wind or for solar in the United States, that cost has tripled or more. Okay, why? Well, I guess a lot of people here will recently have found out about tariffs. That's one reason, but also things like inflation, insurance premiums, and so on. Interest rates have gone up, as we all, I'm sure, are painfully aware. Well, some of us are painfully aware. But the reality is energy costs are going up, not down. So that then brings me to this next piece. Do we have a world where we have perfect being the enemy of the good? So, for example, one of the ways in which we'll do this energy transition, it will not just be electrons. We will continue to need molecules in some way, shape, or form. One way of having sustainable molecules is electrolytic hydrogen or green hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, whatever you want to call it. Today, in the United States, in Europe, and so on, in order to qualify your hydrogen, your electrolytic hydrogen as green, you need to build additional, locally located, hourly matched renewable energy, and you need to build all of this. This is a profoundly expensive way to do things. First of all, I just wanted to do a hydrogen project for whatever reason. I just wanted to do my hydrogen project. You are now making me also go and become a renewable energy project developer as well. That's making my life very, very difficult. If we look at, again, this is a bit of a complex graph, but if we think about the hydrogen intensity that we can get just by plugging into the electricity system that exists, this sort of gray bar is the kind of carbon intensity that you get from gray hydrogen, where you do steam methane reforming and you just don't bother about the carbon emissions. That's the carbon intensity you get here. This blue bar is sort of the best we can do today with what's so-called blue hydrogen, where you add CCS to this methane reforming process. If we, let's say, look at the UK, this blue line, this is where our grid electricity carbon intensity is. We have, I think, reliable policies that we're going to drive our carbon intensity down to very close to zero over the course of the next decade or two. If we do that according to this horizontal blue line, the lifetime average carbon intensity of grid-connected hydrogen will be better than anything we can do with CCS on methane reforming. Right? Now, that presupposes that you're starting at a relatively low space and that you're declining and that you've got a credible policy space and so on and so forth. Other parts of the world, for example, I think this is India, where you're starting at a higher base and we don't get to net zero until much later, that answer is not the same. But in regions where you already have a good starting point, a credible trajectory to a decarbonized electricity system, just plug it into the grid. Don't make people's lives any more difficult than it needs to be. And I think a lot of this renewable energy or energy transition piece has been characterized by making perfect the enemy of the good. Then moving on to I think hopefully the final piece, we often hear this narrative that, well, what's the point of us in the UK doing anything relative to much of the rest of the world? We're emitting hardly anything at all. We really need to worry about India and particularly China. They're the ones emitting everything. Why are we doing anything? When you look at this, however, on a per capita basis, you can see, still the US and the UK, they're much larger on a relative basis. But the real issue is that, yes, quite a lot of carbon emissions are coming from other parts of the world. But those emissions go into products that we consume here in North America, in Europe. So this issue of balancing carbon emission and carbon consumption becomes really important. And so this is some work from back in 2010. And you look at where we are in this, according to our world in data, in 2022, nothing has really changed. You've got parts of the world that emit a lot of the carbon and parts of the world that consume all of the carbon. And that's just in the sort of goods and services that we consume. If we then start thinking about the actual energy that we use in the country as well, so we go to places like, North America, Europe, Japan, we've got about 1 billion people who, just thinking about oil, consume something on the order of 15 barrels per person per day in aggregate. The rest of the world, the other 7 billion people on the planet, consume more in the sort of 3 to 4 range. So this sort of population energy disparity is really profound. And one thing I can guarantee you is that the 7 billion people living here are not going to be happy to have their energy consumption limited to this level forever. They will want to improve that quite reasonably. We think about over the balance of the century, we expect to see the population on a sort of middle of the road basis go to something like 10 billion, with population growth first in Asia and then subsequently in Africa. All of these people will want improved access to energy services and an improved standard of living. So to put some more numbers on this, today oil in this sort of lucky 1 billion, it's about 13 barrels per person. China, it's a number a bit like 4. India, Africa, closer to 1. Southeast Asia, on balance, 3-ish, right? If we then think about, just a thought experiment, what if India and Africa wanted to just get to a China level, so a number that's a bit like 4 in terms of barrels of oil per person per day, that would equate to about another 20 million barrels per day of energy demand. And just for absolute clarity, I'm not suggesting that it will be in the form of energy, but this sort of energy equivalent and for those services that now we currently use oil for. So question, A, is 20 million a lot? And B, well, electric vehicles, right? So we use about 100 million barrels of oil per day globally. So to add 20 to that would be, I think, a very big number. That's very challenging. I'm not sure if it's readily doable. So that then in turn pushes you into the more diversity. And I think the broad lesson of our energy evolution over the course of the last several centuries is we move toward more and more diverse sources of energy, not less. In terms of then EVs, well, first of all, a barrel of oil, it doesn't just give you gasoline. EVs, broadly speaking, in my view, displace gasoline services. Yes, it's possible for electricity to displace diesel and so on, but I think mostly it's gasoline. So you start off by being limited to a fraction of the barrel. The second piece, only less than 10% of car sales worldwide are new cars. Vast majority of places, people buy second-hand cars. A second-hand battery is not as good as a new battery. A second-hand EV is not as good as a new car. So EVs will displace that first car piece, much less the second-hand car piece. So the rate at which EVs will displace gasoline demand, I think, will be relatively attenuated. But of course, now I'm talking about predicting the future, and predictions are uncertain, especially when we're trying to predict the future. Today, for example, we had IEA produce their scenarios. OPEC recently had their world oil outlook, and they have these very, very traditionally divergent worldviews. IEA's fossil energy use, so according to their net zero scenarios, they think that everything, oil, natural gas, and coal, is going to collapse and collapse quite quickly. OPEC, funnily enough, thinks that oil, gas, and oil renewables and so on, everything except coal will go up. And for some reason, OPEC think that coal use is going to go down. Now, in 2023, I spent quite a bit of time in South Asia working with the World Bank and meeting different governments down there. And the one message that I consistently got was, we are going to use quite a lot more coal. And when you then go and look at what we've forecasted in the past relative to what's actually happened, the IEA, and this is from Tony Blair's recent piece, we've had to consistently revise upwards how much coal we actually think we're going to need. So, again, predictions are difficult. Then the next challenge is that this whole transition piece, it's quite expensive. So I think since 2010, I want to say, we spent about $9 trillion worldwide trying to get the energy transition to where it is today, $9 trillion worldwide. If we think about this transition to 2050, this is the spend, on average 9 trillion, ramping up till sort of 11 per year, every year to 2050. That works out to, in today's numbers, that works out to somewhere in the sort of range of 7 to 8% of the world's economy or world's GDP. And for context, COVID cost us something on the order of 3.5%. So the cost of COVID, double that every year for the next 25 years, and that gets us on this sort of net zero trajectory. It's pretty costly. The Manhattan Project, the Apollo projects, they were down in the sort of 0.2, 0.3% of the economy, of the US economy back then. So these are profoundly large numbers. What I think that tells us is that this is not going to come through, public sector subsidies and tax breaks and so on. This has to come from the international capital markets. The challenge with that is that historically, investments in this sort of clean or green energy space, they've broadly speaking underperformed the rest of the market. Okay? So this then in turn begs the question, how do we create the market conditions and regulatory environment that will actually improve in a sustained way the attractiveness of this sector? And I dare say I dare say ideas like carbon product intensity standards might have a role to play going forward. This is also really important because touching back on this sort of cost of energy, broadly speaking, the performance of our economy, it really is just energy transformed. We can go back again looking at the last 100 years of the S&P 500 in the United States over the price of oil, and every time that we've had a bare economy, a period of economic underperformance, this has been characterized by structurally expensive energy. Fundamentally, high energy prices are invariably inflationary. So again, we've spoken quite a lot over the last couple of years around how challenging inflation can be for a society to adapt to. Again, there is this very well understood correlation between how wealthy an economy is, the GDP per capita, and the amount of energy services to which they have access. There's this big empty space down here in these rich countries that don't use an awful lot of energy. There aren't apparently any of those, right? So if you want to have high standard of living, you need access to energy. And this is then really kind of funny because in 2022, at the same time as Europe was having this basically energy crisis arising from the Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, they were at the same time condemning Uganda and Tanzania for violations of human rights. What had Uganda and Tanzania done? They had the temerity to try and develop their own fossil energy resources for their own use. Uganda had quite a pithy response to that. And I think that was kind of justified because at the same time as the European Commission was having this condemnation piece, Germany, France, Italy, Portugal, Spain, they were all going into places like Senegal and Nigeria trying to take gas out of Africa for use in Europe. So you guys should use just the wind and the solar thing, but this fossil, we want to take it home. So this is quite a difficult position, I think, for a region to take. And then more recently, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, has basically come out and said exactly the same thing again. So yes, we understand that there's a need for transition, but we have to balance that against the need to eliminate poverty, provide education, health, and basic infrastructure. And we do not want to be frustrated by the dictates of others that don't consider what we have to face here at home. So this piece on respecting the national sovereignty of other countries is absolutely important. Now, to try and flip this a little bit and start being a little bit more positive, this is not just cost and pain. This is a 9 trillion a year investment opportunity. This is the opportunity to grow the economy, to invest in this world at this level, and we can make this can be profoundly valuable. So again, the counterfactual is not zero. The counterfactual is we do nothing, we'll have to adapt to climate change. That can be very significant. It possibly end up very, very 30% more poor than we would otherwise be. Again, I mentioned tipping points earlier. These come with hugely asymmetric downside risks. So again, the cost of not doing something is not zero. It could be almost infinity. Our ability to provide food, water, and manage societal or human migration, again, very, very challenged in some of these do-nothing scenarios. So the upside opportunity, I think, is very significant. Now, the challenge so that is true, I think, at a kind of macro level, at a global level, but different countries, again, according to some work that we did a few years ago, different countries will benefit more or less. So if you're in a place like Spain, any way we cut it, trying to think about the energy transition, it was all good news. You would grow the economy, you would create jobs, you would export technologies, all of these things. So great if you're Spain. What we observed, though, however, is that if you were Poland, every transition pathway came at a cost. And so understanding how to address these disparities will become an urgent priority, I think. I mentioned that I spent quite a bit of time in South Asia back in 2023, and at that time, this is when CBAM was being discussed and brought into focus. And the view that I sort of persistently encountered was that this carbon border adjustment mechanism thing, this CBAM, this is a trade barrier, it's a protectionist move, you guys don't do this, how can we, so on and so forth. It wasn't viewed positively. Now, happily, I think now, it is much more viewed as, okay, so there's a market for these things, and if we can meet these carbon intensity product standards, then we will invest. And I've been speaking with organizations over the last couple of months where I'm seeing exactly this start to happen. But we do need to recognize that what we try to do here may not be perceived as just or fair in other parts of the world. I think we had, and again, it's a little bit ironic giving this talk today, given that COP is just about getting started in Brazil, but I think that the COP agreement in 2015, I think that was a singular moment of success. I don't think we're going to see anything like that anytime soon. I am very happy to predict that we will see the end of this year's COP without any significant progress or any significant move. I think seeking for global consensus at this point in time is not the best use of people's time and energy. I think smaller tables can get things done much more quickly and much more meaningfully relative to nothing. And so as a thought experiment, what happens if, for example, the UK, that's my perspective at least, is that we are not wonderful when it comes to building infrastructure, okay? For example, railway tracks. We're not the best at that. Other parts of the world, Indonesia, for example, fantastic at getting things done. The reality, or at least according to the analysis that I've participated in, for the cost of doing CCS on a coal plant in Indonesia is a half to a third the cost of doing the same on a gas plant in the UK. So putting that another way, for the money that we could spend in the UK to avoid 1 ton of CO2, we could spend it in somewhere like Indonesia and avoid 2 or 3. There's got to be a way to think about how countries can collaborate across internationally to get things like this done. Some work that we did a couple of years ago looking at fleet-wide analyses in China would indicate that there are billions of tons of carbon that can be mitigated at prices that are within shouting distance of, well, actually that are well below the current EU and UK ETS price. So the carbon price in Britain or Europe will be enough to motivate all of this abatement today. Surely that's worth investigating. So to try and wrap this up a little bit, where I want to conclude is that our awareness of climate change is not new. We've known about this for a very, very long time. We face, however, an energy hierarchy, not an energy trilemma. The world of 2015 and the worlds of 2025, they are literally worlds apart. They're vastly different. National security and geopolitics will trump climate considerations. This is not any one stakeholder group's responsibility to fix. So taxpayers, consumers, and investors all have a role to play. Respecting the national sovereignty of individual countries is a must. It's not optional. We will, however, in order to meet this growing energy demand, and today we talk an awful lot about the AI theme, big hyperscalers and so on. We have this new growth in energy demand in the OECD, but in other parts of the world, they will also want to increase their access to energy service, and that will require every tool in the shed. So being this habit that we've had of categorizing some forms of energy as good and some forms of energy as bad, I think we need to drop. We need to focus less on cost and sacrifice and giving things up and much more on economic growth and value creation. And finally, presenting climate change mitigation as a set of binary choices is a fundamental mistake in the context of this transition. And so what do we need to get to net zero? Everything, everywhere, all at once. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thanks, Niall, for an extremely thought-provoking lecture. We have 10 minutes or so for questions, which I presume you're willing to take.
As long as they're easy.
So we have microphones that will come to you if you'd like to ask a question. We will also have some online. And if you'd please state your name when you ask your question, that would be good. Who would like to ask a question? There's one at the back there.
The lady just here.
Hi, my name is Rina. Really good presentation. I loved the whole of it, specifically the energy hierarchy. Something that stood out to me was so the tiers, basically availability, affordable, secure, and also clean energy, clean water, and etc. So my question is, how can policymakers and industry leaders balance these tiers in practice? Like mostly specifically, for example, when it comes to like short-term energy security pressures, whether it is like geopolitical crisis or supply shocks, how can they, in this case, balance these tiers? I hope I did like a nice summary of the question. Let me know if I can simplify it.
So I thought I said I was willing to take easy questions.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can balance these things. So if you look back to 2022, right, gas prices went up. We didn't do without energy. We didn't, gas supplies were reduced and so on. Nobody said, okay, well, shucks, that's too bad. We'll just reduce our energy use. We switched coal plants back on. We started burning diesel fuel instead of natural gas, right? So I don't think that there's a balance. The whole point is we will absolutely prioritize availability of energy over and above anything else. Now, I didn't get into it here, but it is absolutely possible to have, at least according to the work that we've done, it's absolutely possible to get a balance between increased security of supply and sustainability and affordability. You pay a little bit more for it. It's not the cheapest option, but perhaps in hindsight, it's not a bad idea. But we will not sacrifice availability of energy at any cost, is my opinion. And actually, maybe to kind of go one further on that, at the same time as we turned on the coal plants, etc., the EU went back, and we all went back out to the world and hoovered up all of the natural gas that we possibly could get our hands on, which led to, amongst other things, Pakistan and Bangladesh going back to coal, and quite a few people losing their lives in that part of the world as well. So nobody's giving up energy if they can avoid it at any chance.
Thanks. I think we have a question online next, and then I'll come to questions there.
We have a question from one of our online audience, Finn from Imperial CEP. Hi, Professor Mac Dowell. Thanks for the talk. In the EU, to what extent does transitioning to renewables complement energy security by reducing reliance on important fossil fuels?
So first of all, Finn should have come here if he's at the CEP. Second, to a pretty modest extent, I think, this idea of, the reality is that, Europe suffers as much as anywhere else from intermittent supplies of renewable energy. We have relatively long-term Dunkelflatters that are broadly regional in character. So it's not that the wind doesn't blow in one small area. You get these large regions. So then moving energy around is not so easy. And going back to the previous comment, we're not so good at building very long transmission infrastructure anymore. So I think what you need to do is stop focusing so exclusively on renewable energy if you want to move away from fossil sources of energy. And I can see the rationale for that in Europe, given that we don't really have much of our own. We should think much more carefully about the role that nuclear power can play. But this supposition of a preeminence of exclusively renewable energy, intermittent forms of renewable energy usually, I don't think is a particularly clever idea.
Thanks, Niall. There was a question on that row there in the middle.
Hi, my name is Kanchan, and thank you so much. I just love the presentation, particularly. My question is more broad and probably general, but I wanted to understand how is it that 192 countries actually came together to agree upon something when they don't seem to agree upon anything otherwise? And where do you see this going? Because I think countries are dropping out. There's more questions being raised about how aligned they are at this point.
So I'm not answering the first part of that question. I wasn't in the room. Where do I see this going? So I think the energy transition, will continue for the same reasons that it's been continuing, right? I mean, the reality is that, places like the United States, Europe, and so on have been reducing their emissions. The places like China, India are also looking at this very carefully for either because they recognize the imperative of climate change, they recognize that there's value in, for example, having cleaner air, cleaner water, which comes along with mitigating a lot of the pollutants that cause climate change. So I think this will happen anyway. If we just focus in on the US, because I think that's where a lot of the kind of innovation gets focused. Yes, the federal government currently is not that focused on making climate change mitigation a priority, but roughly half of the United States, roughly half of those states are Democrat states. Roughly half of the states, maybe a better way to put that is half of the states have their own clean power plans, and they're proceeding anyway. So regardless of what happens at the federal level, we talk a lot about this sort of the AI energy demand. Pretty much all of those hyperscalers who are driving that, they all have their own corporate commitments to net zero, and they're pursuing, they're looking almost exclusively for low carbon and sustainable forms of energy for that as well. So I think this is going to happen sort of anyway. And again, this is what drives my enthusiasm for these sort of small clubs of organizations of countries getting together to try and work together in a more pragmatic way as opposed to seeking this global consensus. I think if what you're asking for is global consensus, that's a pretty good delaying tactic.
Do we have another one online? One more here.
Another one from Peter, UCL. How much heavy lifting can we expect from international emissions trading?
Pass. That's interesting. I mean, again, it goes to this piece of, well, if you can have clubs that are willing to work together, I'm not sure I'm not sure that I would characterize that as heavy lifting, though. I mean, I think that's low-hanging fruit if you think about it pragmatically. I think you could do a lot like that. But I'm not going to try and put a number on it.
Good. Question at the front here.
There was one that was asked earlier, that's why.
Okay. We'll take this one, then we'll take the one.
Thanks, Neil, for a good overview. Feel a bit depressed. We were going through some of these issues 20 years ago when we started the Energy Futures Lab. But isn't the solution obvious? We could shut down the country here and make minor impact. The obvious solution is help the emerging nations, in particular those who have growing population, to acquire a standard of living that they aspire to, quite rightly, following it much less intensity. So we should invest there, not here. I think you hinted at that.
Yeah, that was bluntly, that's exactly what I was proposing, right? I think that is exactly the answer. So I think maybe two things. So A, that's exactly what I was getting at. We should try and get countries to work together in that way. I think that there are great opportunities for better leveraging the finance that we have available to us. We can think quite cleverly about tech transfer and using the skills that we have uniquely in this country. I think we can do a lot of that. But it's also important to demonstrate that it can be done. And I don't mean this in any sort of pejorative sense, but for example, the work that the UK has done over the course of the last, 20 years to get to, where we are with CCS, those are business models, frankly, that can be exported globally, right? The understanding of how to manage cross-chain risk, for example, and long-term liability for stored CO2. I mean, again, that's the kind of thing that we need to do here and then expand internationally. So it's not that we do nothing here and only work in third countries, but rather we start here and then expand globally.
So if you want to go up to the person that asked you a question here, I think there was one just behind you there. We'll take this one first and then yours.
Sorry, is it me?
Yes.
Hi, Neil. Thanks for the talk. I'm Felix. I'm a master's student at the university here. My question is about something you mentioned at the start, which is you believe that it's not the transition isn't going to happen from a behavioural shift. But then you showed the graph of our per capita usage of barrels of oil. I think is at 16 per person. I'm personally of the belief that we're not going to be able to sort of silver bullet, with some sort of technological change, get ourselves out of this problem. So I suppose my question to you, it's more of a challenge or a thought experiment, but specifically for you, if you had to change people's behaviors, how would you do that?
So I'm not sure if I was unclear, but just to be crystal clear, I wouldn't waste my time.
Short and sweet, thank you.
Hi. Thanks, Professor Niall. Is it Professor Niall? I'm not sure, like if it's Professor. But anyway, I'm Meera, and I really like your point about like how the consumption of energy is happening in the US, UK, and Western countries, even when the emissions are happening in India, China, and like the global South. My question is about the electrification bit that you said, like only, like since the last 40 years, there's not much that has changed in terms of the role of electricity in the energy system. And then you also mentioned about like the second-hand EVs and batteries don't perform as well as the new ones. We've been doing our small group seminars on critical minerals and how a lot of the distribution of these critical minerals is also unequally distributed in China, Africa, and other parts. So with the electrification and now like the encouragement of electrification that we're hearing about, like how do you see the role of critical mineral mining sort of adding to the emissions and also like the increase in emissions in these parts of the world?
Can we start screening these questions? So I think you're right that regardless of how we progress, the strategic importance of these critical materials is only increasing. So that's something we need to think carefully about. I think we'll need to think a lot. We'll need to think much. So historically, what we do is you buy a widget of some kind, a car, a fridge, whatever. It comes to the end of its useful life and it's thrown away, right? And nobody really tracks where these materials go. As we've, again, people in this room know, some people in this room know far more about this than I do, but people are naive. They start mining in the best places, and then over time we end up mining in less good places. So quite quickly you get to a place where a sort of aggregated waste, old cars, fridges, etc., become very promising sources of these raw materials, right? That's point one. So I think that there's room for a sort of new ownership model where instead of just selling and getting rid of it forever and disposing of it is not my problem, you move to a more of a lease or a sort of a take-back style solution where you can start aggregating this material to mitigate that challenge, right? So you start cutting that supply chain and bringing it closer to home. On the waste associated with this, I think you're absolutely right. So we published a paper a year or two ago showing, if we start thinking about the deployment of hydrogen and wind and solar and EVs, et cetera, batteries and so on, the amount of these materials that we'll need, iridium, molybdenum, and so on, the amount of these materials that we're going to need going forward, it very rapidly exceeds what we currently produce. The implications, we need to do a lot more mining than we do today. Mining is not terrific for the environment, and historically what we've done with mine tailings, the wastes that are associated with that, we pile them up in the ocean, or we pile them up in the land, or we dump them into the ocean. So thinking very carefully how to mitigate the environmental impact of those pollutants, I think, is going to be very important as well. So I hope that sort of gets into the space of addressing your question.
So if you give such a wide-ranging lecture, you can expect questions that go to places that you wouldn't otherwise expect. But I'm afraid there's lots of hands up still, but I'm afraid we're going to have to curtail the questions at that point. But there's an opportunity to speak to Niall afterwards. Those of you who haven't had a question, apologies to those of you online that haven't had the chance to ask your question. So I'm now going to ask Professor George Jackson if he'd like to come forward to propose a vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I start by greeting you here. It's my distinct honor and privilege to deliver the vote of thanks on this memorable occasion. Thank you, Niall. Celebrating Niall's distinguished career and achievements, and we all really loved your wonderful lecture. First and foremost, and on behalf of Imperial College London, I extend a heartfelt thanks to the entire gathering here for gracing us with your presence, and especially Niall for his truly insightful and thought-provoking address. Niall, your broad expertise and valuable insights that you have shared with us on the challenges and intricacies of getting to net zero have genuinely enriched our knowledge and have given us a fresh perspective, which I think we all very much appreciate. It is highly significant that you deliver your lecture at Imperial, where in June 2019, the Right Honourable, the Baroness May of Maidenhead, our then Prime Minister, committed the UK to a target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. We're in 2025 now, and I think things are changing. Yeah, that was just wishful thinking, Sandra. Niall, it's most impressive how you weave together the key scientific, engineering, industrial, economic, social, and political perspectives that have to be taken into account holistically to achieve this energy transition. The emphasis that you place on catalyzing influence, heightened energy security as having an accelerating net zero is really interesting. And I think rather than just a focus on the moral considerations, I think that's a very interesting perspective. Thank you very much, Niall, again, from all of us here. In continuation, I'd like to thank the events team at Imperial, especially Lauren Davis. I can't see her now, but she's outside. Okay, well, thanks very much to Lauren and all the volunteers that are working so hard behind the scenes coordinating the success of this event. My thanks also goes out to this wonderful audience for your enthusiastic participation. It was wonderful to see all of these questions that you were asking Niall, and making him sweat is always a good thing, and for being such a patient set of listeners. And finally, on a more personal note, Niall, I would like to thank you for being such an exceptional and enthusiastic PhD student when you were in our molecular systems engineering group. Also then as a close world-leading researcher in our collaborations since you've been at Imperial. And then throughout, as a dear friend offering me the emergency use of your couch, which was very appreciated, with a few steaks and a few wee drams thrown in. So slante, Niall. I don't want to keep you from your drinks and snacks any longer, so I will end by expressing my sincere appreciation again to all of you for making today so memorable.
Thanks very much, George. You speak on behalf of all of us. And so, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for being here. We now invite you to join Niall and his guests outside to have a drink and a few nibbles, and maybe to ask those questions which you didn't get a chance to answer in the plenary. Thanks very much for coming. Thank you, Niall.